Yeah. With that, I turn it over to Mr. Garcia.
Thank you very much. Sergeant Major, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you today. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. I appreciate you coming out. I've spent the last day and a half at Camp Johnson and at Cherry Point, and I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys did too. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Let me do a little bit of disclosure before I begin. The first is to simply observe that I have never worn the uniform of any of the armed services in the United States. I've never been in the military, so I don't have any direct experience of the things that you do every single day. Having said that, for 25 years, I lived at and my father taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point. So from the time I was 2 to the time I was 27, I was around people in uniform all the time. And so I have perhaps a slightly greater familiarity with the challenges of people in uniform than many civilians may. With that, 28 years ago, I was invited to join the New York University faculty, and initially to solve a particular challenge that the public relations industry had in New York City. And that is, there were lots and lots of people who were really good at doing the mechanics of media relations and public relations, but they couldn't think strategically. And so I was asked, please create a course to teach strategy to communicators. I now find myself spending lots of time teaching communication to strategists. But my initial challenge was to teach strategy to communicators. And in 1988, there were no strategy books for communicators. So I required my graduate students in communication to read Carl von Clausewitz's On War. I was not a very popular professor. But there were two particular concepts in On War that I believe had direct applicability to communication. The first is that just as war is the continuation of policy by other means, communication is the continuation of business by other means. And as Clausewitz points out, means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. So my challenge was to beat into them, what is your purpose? What is your purpose? Means can never be considered in isolation from your purposes. There's another concept from On War. Clausewitz defined war as an act of will directed toward a living entity that reacts. Communication is also an act of will directed toward a living entity that reacts. And I found that I could actually build strategic thinkers using the principles of Clausewitz with just a little tinkering of the vocabulary. About 12 years ago, I began to teach MCDP1 in civilian graduate schools. And I found that by changing some of the vocabulary, we could create a really powerful conceptual framework that helps civilians be strategic in their application of communication to accomplish a purpose. So with that, I worked with the Marine Corps in the development of the book that became The Power of Communication: Skills to Build Trust, Inspire Loyalty, and Lead Effectively. And I do 3 things in that book. The first is I inventory what works and what doesn't work and why. What works and what doesn't work and why, so that leaders can stop doing what doesn't work because they know why it doesn't work. And they can start to do what does work because they know it will work. So what works and what doesn't work and why. The second is I translated MCDP1, as you call it, warfighting, as I and my students call it, and use it as a conceptual framework to make smart choices and to engage effectively to accomplish purpose through interpersonal communication in any environment. Today we're going to talk about how to apply those principles in a media environment. But one of the things I do at my firm, we have a think tank called the Logos Institute, and we take the principles of MCDP1 and we create models to predict how any given stakeholder group is likely to behave when subjected to any particular stimulus. So how are investors going to behave? We model it. How are regulators going to behave? We model it. How are employees going to behave? We model And we also model how the media behaves. And I'm going to share that with you today. And then the final thing I do in the book is I distill it all down into 9 principles of effective leadership communication, 9 ways that we, as leaders, can understand our role in using interpersonal verbal engagement to accomplish our purposes. How do we inspire confidence? How do we inspire trust? How do we change behavior? How do we create a culture of excellence through interpersonal verbal engagement? With that, one of the things I found really interesting about MCDP1 is you've distilled all of Clausewitz into an easy-to-read form. And by the way, extremely well written, which confounds expectations among my civilian clients. Really clear and really helpful. So, for example, first paragraph of MCDP1 says that war is fundamentally an interactive social process. By the way, when my clients hear that the Marines define war as fundamentally an interactive social process, they think that's really cool. As with war, similarly, communication is fundamentally an interactive social process. And as with war, communication is thus a process of continuous mutual adaptation, of give and take, of move and counter-move. And oh, by the way, the civilians at this point think this is really cool. More significantly for modeling stakeholders, I find what you say about the enemy is really powerful when I think about it in terms of the audience. And you say about the enemy that it is critical to keep in mind that the enemy is not an inanimate object to be acted upon, but it's an active, living group of human beings, so is the audience. The audience is not a passive receiver of message, it is an active participant in the interaction with you, and they have their own attention spans, their own concerns, their own levels of desire, even to be in relationship with you. It is essential that we understand the audience on its own terms and not on our own terms. And just as with the enemy, we should not assume that the audience thinks as we do, makes decisions as we do, has the same values, goals, and priorities as we do. They definitely do not. Therefore, effective engagement of audiences says we need to see ourselves through the audience's eyes and define the world as the audience defines itself. I learned that from you. I didn't learn that out in the world of public relations. I learned that from MCDP1. And therefore, effective communication tries to get inside the audience's thought process and then makes decisions in light of their anticipated reaction and counteraction, much as we heard in Major Kern's discussion of the red and green cells. We try to make decisions based on what they're going to do. I model that in my think tank for any form of stakeholder. Today, we're going to apply it to one particular stakeholder group, and that is the news media. What happens when the news media is around what you do or comes upon what you do? And what I find is when the media is around anyone and comes upon what they do, the media behaves in completely predictable ways. They behave in completely predictable ways that are often baffling to people who are not familiar with the media, that sometimes cause some career-defining or career-limiting moments for people in uniform, that sometimes cause some harm to the national interests of the United States, but can also advance the interests of people in uniform, of your unit, of the MEF, of the Corps, and of the national interests of the United States when it is done right. The question I always get, whether from someone with stars on his collar, or from someone whose title is Archbishop, or University President, or CEO, when they are covered by the news media, is usually some version of, why did they do that? Why did I talk to them for 45 minutes, and they only used what I said off the top of my head on the walk back to the elevator? Why did I talk to them for 25 minutes about all the really important stuff, and they only used that flippant joke that is no longer funny when it appears in the pages of the Washington Post? Why? And in almost every instance, what I conclude after reading the piece and talking with people in the room, the news coverage that the leader objects to was completely predictable and therefore completely preventable. And that's because the leader had inadvertently committed news in the presence of a reporter. And it is my earnest hope, generals and others, that you never inadvertently commit news, that you only intentionally commit news. And we're going to spend the balance of our time figuring out how to avoid the inadvertent commission of news and how to intentionally commit news that only helps.